All right, guys. Welcome aboard for the February 2004, February 14, 2016 um, Mac Forum Sunday video chat. This is your host, Sly Dude. I'll be with you this evening as usual. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Those of you that were watching the Super Bowl last Sunday, hopefully your team won. Congrats to the Broncos. And let's go ahead and get right into the day's show and information here. Got a few tips and tricks, the usual forum roundup, as well as some other Mac related news and comment. First of all, let's just say that as of about a half an hour before showtime, i.e., 6:30 Central Time, we were just short of 287,000 members, the newest of which is iCloud X. So, welcome to them and to all of our new members that we've added in the last week. Want to go ahead and encourage you if you have been lurking the forum and you haven't posted a question, but you've been kind of lurking and reading, and you need to post a question, feel free to do that. But you do need to become a member. It doesn't cost you anything. And while you're on the Mac Forum main page, if you can't make it every day to check in, and I know not everyone can, to see what's going on, have a look at signing up for the Mac Forum newsletter. Comes out weekly, if I remember correctly, and it'll give you a nice overview of what's been going on in the forum, including links to some of the more active threads. So if you can't make it in every day to check in, then feel free to check that out. That's a very good way to stay in touch with what's going on the forum. This week, a lot of, as usual, there have been some more forum questions about El Capitan, some troubleshooting issues relative to Time Machine, and also with some people having issues with external hard drives that may or may not be function of their El Capitan install. We're still digging on that and trying to figure out what's going on there. It's not that these are widespread issues, but they are things that some of our members are having issues with. And we've got a very knowledgeable crew of members who are always lurking around waiting to answer questions. Some of our guys basically live to answer questions. I think we've got them in the stasis tank in the back room there, just waiting to tap their knowledge. Um, and there are a ton of good questions, lots of good information. No matter how long or short a time you've been using a Mac, you're subject to find some information that's helpful to you. So join us for that. I want to get right into some of the things that are coming up this week. First of all, Cult of Max Killian Bell has some interesting thoughts on the question of whether the 2016 Mac laptops, in other words, any new laptops introduced this year, will contain Intel's Skylake processors. Uh, from his perspective, most Intel uh, annual chip upgrades tend to produce about a 10% change in performance. There are some suggestions that the Skylake processors would add about a 20% speed boost, faster data path, and possibly better battery life. Uh, we don't know for sure that these processors are going to be in any new Macs that are released this year, but it's a pretty good bet that at some point soon we will see Skylake processors. Now, my take on this is essentially not that Skylake is a bad idea, but it may be a while before you see uh, improvement, and that is uh, I'm gonna personally, I'm not in the market for a laptop at the moment, but if I were, I might resist the temptation to ditch my old gear and wait with bated breath for the Skylake processor. And I'll tell you why. Uh, eh, some users, depending upon what they use their Mac for, may not notice a huge boost in Skylake if they had the Skylake processor. We don't know yet. If you're just surfing the web and emailing and light to medium duty Mac use, you may or the speed boost from Skylake may or may not be worth whatever the cost might be. We don't know that either at this point. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that for some changes, sometimes when a change is made to a processor, we don't see the full benefit of the speed until uh, applications are updated. I haven't seen anything yet that says whether or not uh, the Skylake applications would have to be updated to take advantage of Skylake. I don't think they were, from what I read and from reading that article. I don't think you would need major rewrites to take advantage of Skylake, but to make full advantage of the faster data path, that might help a little bit. Uh, so I'm kind of taking the wait and see attitude, looking and see what the benchmarks are going to be, what some real world tests are going to be. I don't get me wrong. I used to read the Geekbench and other benchmark scores on a regular basis, and now I tend to pay a little more attention to real world numbers because sometimes those benchmark scores just are really difficult to make sense out of unless you are just very technically minded. So we'll see. I kind of hope we do see Skylake processors. Anytime we can see a speed jump, I'm in favor of that. But I'll wait until they appear before I start drooling and salivating and shorting out the keyboard here. All right. Last week, I told you about an error that was occurring for some uh, iPhone users who had their home slash touch ID buttons replaced. And on some iPhone models, if you had the touch ID button replaced, and then you went to do the most recent system update for iOS 9, you were discovering that iTunes would show you an error 53, and there didn't seem to be any way out of this error. It essentially, it seems, bricked the device. And the error message, as I say, it was produced in iTunes, gives you very little clue about the possible causes. Not all of the devices with Touch ID were affected. The iPhone 6 and 6 Plus seem to be, as well as some iPads with Touch ID. But we're not sure yet whether the 6S and 6S Plus were affected, and the fives, the iPhone 5s, do not seem to be affected at this point. Um, in looking at Cult of Mac's summary, which has a little more information than it had last week, um, one of their suggestions was if you've ever had that part replaced, and it's not just the Touch ID that button that was causing the problem. Apparently, some users who had their screens replaced were also experiencing problems. And so, Cult of Mac's recommendation was basically to say if you've ever had a part replaced by anyone other than the Apple Store, don't update your iPhone's software. It appears that only Apple stores have a hardware capable of reestablishing an authentic connection between the Touch ID pad and your iPhone's secure enclave. Now, Cult of Mac goes into a little bit of question about whether this is a deliberate thing by Apple to cut down on repairs by third party vendors, whether this is a mistake, whether this is some kind of hardware check error. I'm not going to speculate on all of that. I will say that it's annoyed quite a few people, and I hope they get this sorted out pretty quickly. I know I would be rather upset if I had a device that had been bricked, regardless to whether it was accidental. Of course, the suggestion that they're doing it deliberately is a little more sinister, and I have a hard time believing that. That's just my 2 cents. It's just not smart from a marketing perspective at all. That's the reason I have a hard time believing it, that it's a deliberate thing. Um, all right, let's go on and let's take a look at some of the other things. On one of our tips for this week, if you are a Snapchat user, you might find this interesting. I personally am not, but I found this a very interesting idea. Uh, if you are a Snapchat user, it's a good probability that one of your reasons for using Snapchat is the fact that photos disappear automatically after a period of time. And when some users discovered that it was possible to take screenshots of a chat and thus preserving a picture indefinitely, Snapchat countered that by letting users know when someone was trying to sneak a screenshot of one of their pictures. Well, now there some savvy Snapchat users have found a workaround to that feature. In other words, if they wanted to get a screenshot without the other person knowing about it, there is a workaround that involves making use of airplane mode to take the snapshot. Essentially, you're taking yourself off the network, taking the snapshot, and then logging out and coming back on. Uh, I have a link to that article in case some of you are interested and want to have some ideas about how this is done and what you might do to prevent it. Uh, Along a different note, uh, our good buddy Kirk McLaren, who I've referenced a number of times in the show, did a recent appearance on the Mac Voices podcast, in which he discusses the pros and cons of creating a lossless iTunes library. And by lossless, let me just go into a little bit of just a brief bit of background here. There are some means of compressing. If you start with a CD, for example, files stored on a CD typically take up roughly 10 megabyte per minute. So a typical 60-minute CD is going to have roughly 600 to 700 megabyte of data on it. That in the days before computer hard drives became gargantuan, that just wasn't very practical, although that gives you the closest match to the real thing, so to speak. So you had various methods of saving the files. Some of them, like MP3, are what are considered lossy in the sense that they compress the file significantly, but some of the digital data is lost in the process. And some audiophiles do not like this, and they think they can hear the difference between a compressed and uncompressed file. Now, there are a number of lossless formats which give you a degree of compression but preserve much more of the data. Apple has a lossless format. I believe FLAC is lossless, etc. So Kirk and the gang over at Mac Voices spent some time talking about this. I have a link to that in the show notes. And I've linked to it in two different ways. One is directly to the Mac Voices podcast video, and the other is to the link that's on Kirk's website, his Kirkville website. And the reason I did that that way is the if you go to the Kirkville site, he has some other articles related to compression and the ability, the decision to go lossless versus lossy in your iTunes library. And I do want to say that if you want to go to a lossless format, I'm going to make two suggestions to you. I don't know for sure if these are in the video that I linked to for Kurt, because I haven't finished the entire video yet. But I will tell you that two things that I would do if I were trying to decide whether to use lossless versus uh, a more lossy compression format like MP3, I would do some listening tests first. In other words, take a couple of your favorite CDs, take some of your favorite tracks that represent a range of music, save them in a lossless format, such as Apple Lossless, for example, and then save them also in a high level MP3 format or some other lossy format and play them on your listening gear. Because, first of all, you're going to spend some time doing this. I don't think it's a good idea to go from a lossy format like MP3 to try to go to something lossless like Apple Lossless. That doesn't make sense. You're going to have to re-rip your CDs to get the benefit of moving, whatever benefit there might be to moving to that lossless format. So re-ripping them is going to be a little bit time consuming. Uh, Before you spend the time doing that, find out if you are going to be able to hear the difference. Whether your neighbor, your spouse, your significant other can hear the difference is one thing. Uh, Whether you can hear it is going to be the determining factor. I'd hate to have you waste all of that time and have no significant appreciable difference in the sound that you hear. Uh, some people may be able to hear a difference. It's going to depend upon your listening habits, to some extent, on what kind of music you listen to, and also to some extent on the equipment that you're using. If you're predominantly using your iDevice, uh, you may not hear a difference. You may not hear a huge difference. If you've got a good quality stereo with good quality speakers, you may hear a difference. I don't know. There are some, as far as for me, I haven't done extensive testing on this yet. I will tell you that a lot of times I do not notice a huge difference, and I certainly don't notice enough of a difference to make me uh, want to go back and re encode all of those CDs. But I haven't done it in a while. So things could considerably have improved considerably since the last time I checked it. I probably will redo this at some point to see if I can tell a difference. But before you invest that amount of time and energy, do some testing and see if it's going to be a benefit to you. You may decide that the benefit is just not worth the time. Um, Also, from the Kirkville site. If you have ever read audio magazine reviews and conclusions about some piece of audio gear and wondered how they arrived at some of their conclusions, you're not the only one. In Kirk's website this week, he had a piece about uh, an article that a reader sent him the link to, and it had to do with the claims of some people claiming they could hear certain things. If essentially the thesis of the article, this is kind of hard to explain without you having to read it. Essentially, the thesis of this article appeared to be that some hard drives or SSD drives uh, made a difference in the way the sound was reproduced. Now, keep in mind what I'm saying here. I'm not talking about the speakers making a difference or anything like that. Essentially, what they seem to be saying is that if you put uh, a certain sound, certain tracks on this brand of hard drive, it played back in a certain way. And if you put them on this brand of SSD, it played back in a different way, uh, and in ways that were perceptible in terms of the auditory quality. I'm not talking about uh, differences in speed of playback here or access speed, because obviously the SSDs in most cases would have a huge advantage. That's not what I'm talking about. They seem to be implying that um, I take the same track, I put it on different hard drives, different NAS structures, for example, and the audio quality would be affected. And Kirk discusses that a little bit to give you an idea of just how far some of these magazines and websites are stretching the point. Because there really shouldn't be a difference in quality of audio when you're talking about two drives, for example. And once you account for things like access speed, because both drives contain the same track, which is essentially a series of zeros and ones, and that should not be the determining factor on which ones play back better. You know, uh, I could understand if they were saying that uh, a certain uh, piece of gear, a certain receiver played back better, or particularly speakers. This brand of speaker played these tracks better than this brand. This model is better than this model. That would make sense. But the differences that they're attributing to drives just don't make sense to me. And I put the link to that article in there just to give you an idea of some of what's floating around out there in terms of uh, some very questionable claims when it comes to audio. And this is not unique to computers. In the analog days, before everybody moved their music digitally, you saw the same thing in magazines. Sometimes there would be claims about speaker X is better than speaker Y, and I've long questioned how many people can hear the difference. I'm not saying that no one can. What I'm saying is if you pick two speakers of comparable quality and you did blind listening test, there are a lot of people that could not hear the difference. Some people could because they're listening more carefully, because they have not suffered any kind of hearing loss or anything like that. Maybe they're paying closer attention. Things like time of day and how the test is run can affect things. All of these things come into play. And yet you constantly see on the internet and in the old days in paper magazines somebody claiming to be able to hear the difference between various pieces of gear, and some of the differences that they were claiming, I just wasn't too sure about. Not when you look at comparable levels of gear. So, to give you an example of that, I included that article from the Kirkville site. He's got several other interesting pieces of information up this week. Take a look at it. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. A couple of other things I want to point out before we get to the end of the show this evening. One of them is I don't remember exactly which thread this occurred in the forum, but there is a thread going, and in the process of answering the question, member Rad Dave pointed out that there are situations where pressing the option key while you're activating a menu can show you some things that are, for lack of a better word, quote unquote, hidden. And let me just give you an example of what I mean. I've mentioned this tip before, but I thought it was worth reprising. For example, just a couple of examples here. If you have the uh, speaker icon available in your menu bar, go up to the menu bar, right, hover over the speaker icon, hold down the option key, and click on the speaker. Instead of getting the volume slider, what you now get is a list of the inputs, and audio outputs that are available for you to use. And you can change them. So for example, let's say that you have two speaker connections set up there. You've got your regular Apple speaker, internal speaker built in, and you've got maybe some type of AirPlay device as your output. Both of those will generally show up there. Um, or maybe you've got a Bluetooth headset. If it's turned on, it's going to show up in that list generally. Uh, if you run multiple audio inputs, for example, right now I have two microphones connected to the Mac. One is a USB mic, and the other is a mic that is plugged into my very basic audio board. Both of those show up, both the audio board and the USB mic show up as input options, as well as my internal microphone on the iMac. So instead of having to open the sound preferences and making these changes, I can hold down the option key, click on that speaker icon, and make the changes from there. If I do the same thing with the wireless network icon, if I do it without the option key held down, I get a list of available networks and I can switch easily from one network to another. But if I hold down the option key as I click on that wireless icon, I get a lot of statistics about my network, signal to noise ratio, all of these things. You may not need that information every day, but it can come in handy for troubleshooting purposes. And the other reason I mention it is that that is also true in some applications. As some of you know, a lot of applications now, particularly the Apple applications, do not have the same type of save as option that used to be in earlier versions of the operating system and in earlier versions of some applications. But if you, instead of the duplicate option, if you have the option key pressed down when you go to the file menu, you get a whole different array of choices for saving things in some applications. So experiment a little bit with that option key, what it does in different menus. Uh, I recommend that if you're going to experiment, don't do it with critical data. Make a backup copy of whatever file It shouldn't do any damage, but don't take a chance on that. Make a backup copy of the file, and then poke around in pages, in numbers, poke around in the OS, and in preview, and all these different programs, and see what the option key does for you. Uh, you're going to find some pretty interesting things. And finally, kind of as a last tip for you, I've mentioned this one before as well, I think, but it came to mind when I remembered the thread that's going on about Time Machine. First of all, most of you know by now that Time Machine backups are not bootable in the typical sense of the word. In other words, if your hard drive were to have a complete and total meltdown, even if you had a Time Machine backup, you would have to reinstall the OS and then put uh, your Time Machine data onto the drive. Well, one of the things that also comes into play from time to time, if you happen to be using a network drive, such as a time capsule or any other type of NAS device to store your Time Machine backups on, Time Machine stores those backups in a large disk image called a sparse bundle. And the difference between the disk image and the sparse bundle is basically the sparse bundle is capable of growing as needed. And every once in a while, Time Machine will report all kinds of errors. Uh, and sometimes they're kind of hard to figure out. One thing that you can try, I cannot guarantee you that this will always work. But this is something you can try. Disk Utility does not really check the status of that sparse bundle file directly. In other words, you can't go into Disk Utility, look at that sparse bundle file, and see if it's um, got some directory structure issues. What you have to do is try the following. You can't always do this. Sometimes it's damaged enough that you can't do this, but a lot of times you can. I've used this trick a couple times. Find your sparse bundle file that is your Time Machine backup. Double click that file and see if it will mount onto the desktop in the Finder. In other words, it will appear in the Finder as a disk drive. Now, once it's mounted, you can then go into Disk Utility and check it by running Disk First Aid. I last did this before I moved to El Capitan. So you're not going to be able to do permission checks because that's been kind of pretty much wiped away in El Capitan to some extent. But you can do things like verify and repair the directory structure. And sometimes that's all it takes to get that file functioning again. So that keep that in mind as you experience problems. I'm not saying that to say that a lot of people are having problems with Time Machine, or even that's a common problem, but it is something that has occurred on one occasion for me, and I stumbled upon that by accident, and uh, I've mentioned it to one or two people, and it's helped them get out of a bind with Time Machine. So keep that one in mind as well. All right, guys, that's going to just about do it for this week's show. I hope that you've enjoyed all the tips and tricks and information. As usual, uh, we will have the show notes available shortly. Uh, what I'm going to do is, as usual, I'll post the show notes in the Mac Forum Sunday chat thread over on the site, and I'll post a link uh, here on the Google Plus page to that information. I hope that you've enjoyed this week and have had a wonderful week. And until next time, this is your host, Sylvester Rock, aka Sly Dude on the forum. Hoping that you have a great week. And if you have a question or some ideas on improving the show, feel free to post them in the Sunday chat thread. And I always take time to take a look at any comments and things that come through there. So until next week, we'll see you on the Mac Forum Sunday video chat.